Hello lovelies, today we're taking a look at Arcanis, the World of Shattered Empires, which is an Origins Award winner. I tend to put more stock, or used to put more stock, in the Origins than the Ennies, possibly because I won one. But yes, that's a bias, I should declare. Other biases, I should declare. This was a free copy that was hand delivered to me, which is something I appreciate, and I have some links with some of the people involved in the creation and support of this game, so that should be just about everything up front. I think I'm going to say something which sounds bad on the face of it, but isn't necessarily bad. You know how sometimes you're at a game store or a convention or a games club or whatever, and someone wants to tell you about their character. It's a stereotype, right? Because your character is only ever really going to be interesting to you or other people from your group. You know, that sort of thing. The rest of us don't necessarily have the same attachment to your character. And all the while you're telling me about your character, you're blocking the till or using up time that could be spent gaming or whatever else. And Arcanis feels a bit like, tell me about your character in game form, but it's not necessarily bad, because, you know, as a game designer, I like it when people tell me about the characters and games they've played with my products. There's a sort of enthusiasm to it, I think, which I find pleasant and infectious. And yeah, I like to know that my game's being played by someone, even if it's just, you know, once or whatever. So this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can be a little bit overwhelming. And Arcanis kind of feels a bit like that in game form. And again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be a little bit overwhelming. The TLDR of what Arcanis is this is a world of various imperial powers, greatly derived for the most part from some real world examples, but all in a state of decline or collapse. So with, hypothetically, theoretically, plenty of room for adventure, legend making, important choices, bolstering one empire, hastening the doom of another, internal strife and so on. Lots of politics to get involved in. The book has made some weird choices in that it is front loaded with massive amounts of world lore that really could do with being bullet pointed even more than it already is. There are little call out boxes here and there that give you relatively summarized information, but not so much information on that empire or that faction, but more on character naming conventions and things like that. So it could use a bit more of the summary, which sounds weird now that I say it out loud, but hopefully you get what I mean. Yeah, most books don't do this. Most books don't front load themselves with a ton of lore. They introduce the basic concepts, the basic die roll mechanic, and then go into character creation, and lore and so on tends to come later. This does make Arcanis less of an easy read than it might otherwise be, and it feels like you're just being fire-hosed information and exposition as you try to learn the book. It's not a choice I would make. Maybe it's not off-putting to other people, but it was a bit off-putting to me. When it comes to the system itself, this does have its own independent system, but it is working with numbers which will largely be familiar to people who've played, you know, D20 oriented games. One wonders, he says, going on a tangent, why more games don't use the D60, which is highly divisible and great for fractions. But I digress. In Arcanis, you use 2d10 for most rolls, which, here comes the maths, will spike at the average, 11. But you do also add an attribute dice, which is an exploding die. Roll the highest number on the attribute die, and you roll again and add on, and so on. Once you've rolled those dice, you add any modifiers and so on to give you a final total. Target numbers run from 5 to 40 in 5-point breaks, from trivial rolls, which you probably don't need to bother with, to astounding feats at 40. Personally, I'd set the standard difficulty a little bit higher than in D20 games, though. The default difficulty in a standard D20 game is around 15. Anything under that's generally not necessarily worth bothering with a roll for. In this game, I'd set the target for that somewhere around 20 as the default difficulty, unlike 15. Just because of that attribute dice boost. I know it's and the other adds that you get. And it sounds high when you're rolling 2d10 base and and needing to get 20. But with all the modifiers and everything else, it's not as difficult as it sounds. Yeah, that's where I would place the standard sort of worthwhile challenge roll. A double 10, which you only have a 1% chance of, is an automatic success, but not necessarily a crit. An automatic success becomes a critical if that roll would have succeeded without the rule that a double 10 is always an automatic success. So if you roll a double 10, add your attribute dice, all your modifiers, and you would have failed, but you succeed because you rolled a double 10, that's just a success. If you roll all that and you would have gotten a success with that result, then it's a crit. So this is a bit like the confirm criticals thing from several older D20 games, and I think Pathfinder 1st edition, if I'm remembering correctly. But it's a lot neater and has a lot less rolling, though it is still upsetting when you roll a critical and then it turns out not to be a critical after all. A double 1, meanwhile, is an automatic fail. And it doesn't seem to have any qualifiers to that. So dice can be bumped, meaning they increase in size, or penalized, in which case they're reduced in size. So that throws a bit of a spanner in the works, perhaps. And if you've got bumps or penalties that are applied after you've already rolled, this adds or takes away 2 points from the total, which makes sense when you look at the maths. Characters, heroes, are defined by statistics, including might, prowess, quickness, and vigor, along with charisma, insight, logic, and resolve. Attributes have both an active and a passive score, and a dice type attached to them for when you roll to do things. They also determine the derived score of all the usual things that you might expect, like defenses, wounds, initiative scores, and so on. Further defining your character, you have what race or species, if you prefer, they are, their nationality and affiliations. These things provide some other aspects to your character and some options. And on top of that, you also have background and profession as well. You have a robust skill system, flaws for your character to make them have foibles and so on, and talents which are roughly analogous to feats, which are special capabilities your character might have. These ideas and concepts should be familiar from a great many other games. Race-wise, you do get some interesting options. There are Darkkin, who are kind of like tieflings, but they're still edgy. they have darker aspects to them. They are genuinely distrusted. They almost look like asuras from Indian and South Asian lore. So they retain their edginess in a way that tieflings and similar in other games haven't. You're not going to see them hanging out in pastel-coloured caftans having a cup of tea. You're going to find them being run out of town on a rail. So that's somewhat interesting. Dwarves, that I find standard fantasy races I find rather boring. But in this, dwarves used to be giants, and then they were cursed, which is what turned them into dwarves. So they kind of retain that kind of Nordic feel, but they have a reason for existing and being short and everything else. It's because they used to be giants. So that's an interesting and slightly different take on dwarves than I've seen elsewhere, and I really like that. Standard fantasy races tend to bore me, so new takes and interesting spins are good. There's the Alluri, who are basically elves. They're mostly resentful of humans. You could look to The Witcher or Dragon Age, but unsubjugated, at least some of them, and that would give you the best way to understand the Alluri here. Gnomes are the offspring of dwarves and humans, and they're kind of twisted, mutated sort of creatures, pitiful. Are you starting to see a theme here? Everything has a dark side to it. Humans are humans. They come in the usual sort of different hues and flavours that humans do, and are the major culture makers, the main players, the bigger empires. There's a group called the Kyo, who are perfected humans. They have a lot of mystery surrounding them. There are lizard men called Sasresen. The Val, who are god-touched half-humans, more like the offspring of Norse gods than or Greek and Roman gods, than the kind of Aasimar or whatever you might know from D&D. Now, you may have noticed the sort of theme here. There's quite a lot of Robert E. Howard cutting through this to one extent or another, but it's not really about the barbarians outside the decadent evil societies. It's more about the decadent evil societies themselves before they've quite become necessarily so decadent or evil. But there are a lot of the same themes of collapse and degeneracy and complacency running through the various empires. There's a decent crafting and lore skill system, and yeah, all things considered, it's a pretty complete game. There's not a ton of monsters, but the systems for making monsters are also fairly robust in and of themselves. The combat system, which is probably going to be a fixation for most people, it gets a bit complicated, and I would describe it as being semi-simulationist. It uses a tick system for initiative, where a main clock counts down, and when the main clock and your initiative intersect, you take your turn. That uses up a few more ticks, the clock continues on, then you get another action, however many that uses, and so on and so on and so on. So the actions take away ticks from your personal clock and set your new tick score. Cautiously advancing, so moving in combat, is 4 ticks, standing up from prone is 2 ticks, and so on. This is pretty granular, and it's the thing that made Exalted combat rather interminable. Things are sped up a little bit by having minion rules and rules for collecting together a bunch of baddies into one larger baddie, like a sort of Goblin Voltron, which speeds things up a bit, then helps compensate for that. But as I say, it's a semi-simulationist system, so going into that, you kind of know what you're going to be expecting there. Characters take damage as stamina and wounds. Lose all your stamina and you've been beaten, vanquished. If you run out of wounds, you're just straight up dead. The magic system is pretty good. You'll learn a spell, but then when it comes to casting it, you can modify them in various ways, and that changes the difficulty, and then you have to beat that difficulty number to cast the spell. The rate at which you can hurl magic around is slowed down and controlled by strain, which is a time penalty on how often you can cast spells, but you can still do other things while you wait for your magical battery to charge back up. So basically, if you're a magic user, you're essentially going to have an additional clock ticking down as you do things with magic, and you wait for your oomph to come back. But I do like magic systems where you can modify, change and shift things on the fly and do more interesting things with them. I like more freeform magic systems. This isn't quite freeform magic like, say, Mage or something, but it is kind of built into it from the get-go that you'll be doing various things with the spells that you have, making them more effective, tailoring them to the situation, and so on. And it's a lot less clumsy than, you know, meta magic feats or whatever else that you might know from other places. Now, I didn't come away from the book particularly knowing what it is I'm supposed to do in terms... Sorry, I still have work going on at the house. I am not doing another take, but they keep triggering the doorbell. As I was saying, I didn't come away from the book particularly knowing what I'm supposed to do in terms of adventures and so on, and that's a bit of a failing. There's no elevator pitch. You know, I can't look at it and say I am playing an adventurer who I can't do it for this game, right? I mean, you could play it with just the standard sort of fantasy adventurer about town sort of thing, but it feels like it should have more than that. It should be different to that. There should be a sort of recommended style of play, and that's just not really present here. Now, normally I very much go on about how sample adventures are a waste of space, but in this book it would actually be helpful to give some sort of direction on what they expect an adventure to focus on, what they expect an adventure to be, and that's just not here for this one, which is unfortunate, you know. Yeah, I just didn't come away with an idea of what I'm supposed to do. Also, the nature of the collapsing empires and their rivalry and the various racial tensions and so on, while realistic and great, makes it difficult to justify putting a cosmopolitan group of characters together. So while it's got verisimilitude, the playability perhaps suffers a little, though you can of course just ignore that if you want, but it feels like a shame to do that. But all the different factions, you know, largely distrust each other, or are enemies, or are watchful allies. So it gets, especially when it comes to the non-human races, it becomes quite difficult to justify why they would all work together. So overall, at the end of the day, what Arcanis feels like to me is an old school fantasy heartbreaker. From before the D20 boom, so, you know, before the turn of the century, really. Old. It feels like it exists somewhere between Riddle of Steel and Pathfinder First Edition. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, and I found myself feeling quite nostalgic for, you know, when people used to put out fantasy games before the OGL, before all of that, before the whole sort of landscape of gaming was changed by that. You know, some good stuff came out of that. I mentioned the Riddle of Steel yeah, if you like your quasi-realistic combat, you can't go wrong with with the Riddle of Steel. And yeah, I've got plenty of fantasy heartbreakers in my collection, or in my friends' collections. Yeah, they're not all bad by any stretch of the imagination, and it's kind of nice to see a game that kind of feels like one of those games again. You know, they did interesting things from a design perspective. This game does interesting things from a design perspective. Nothing revolutionary, but it's a collection of maybe what we learned from that period, which I guess would run through the 90s for the most part. Yeah, it's a bit of a weird one in that sense. It's almost a book out of time, and it's a good quality example of that kind of thing. Now I'm going to say something else which you might find weird. You've heard me complain a great deal about muddy art, and a lot of the art in this book is dark, or it's in more natural tones. You don't see a lot of pastels or bright colours necessarily, but I like the art in this because it's not the kind of muddy I was talking about, right? The lines and the contrast are good. You can mostly see what's going on. It's well executed. So even though the palette is largely colours that we might associate more with mud, it's not the kind of muddy I mean. When I describe muddy about a lot of modern RPG art, I mean that it's overworked. There aren't defined lines. You can't make out necessarily what's going on, or where the character ends and the background begins, and so on. So the artwork in this is, to one extent or another, mud-coloured, perhaps, but it is not muddy in the sense that I meant. And it is fairly evocative, more of a sort of Greek, Roman, sort of Viking vibe to a lot of it, that I appreciate. So I'll give it a style of 4. The presentation is workmanlike. It's not gonna win any awards for that, I don't think, but it's clear enough to read. I think the lore information, of which there is a lot, could have been presented a bit better, and probably shouldn't have been the first thing in the book, but that's stylistic choices, I guess, rather than anything objectively bad or wrong with it. In terms of substance, this is a complete game. However, I think it suffers from being an all-in-one book. I think they could have done with splitting the book into like a player's guide and DM's guide. I know it's a hackneyed D&D thing, but I really think it could have worked for this game, because as a result of it being an all-in-one, you kind of lose more bestiary, which you could have done. The more in-depth lore information could have been consigned to the Games Master's book, and the player's book could have been more concerned with character creation and acting as a less intimidating primer to the world for the players. Plus, you make more money that way. But it is more complicated, printing and sending them, shipping them together and all of that. So I understand why most people don't do it. But yeah. Even so, though, while it's got everything you need, I don't think it's necessarily presented particularly effectively, efficiently. And yeah, front-loading the lore makes the book kind of off-putting and dense. And even after going through it all, I didn't really come away with an idea of what I'm supposed to do in the game, which is unfortunate, because all things considered, I like it. Partly nostalgia because it reminds me of those 90s games. Partly because it's just an effective and it's an effective game, and it's situated in a different sort of milieu to most fantasy games. It's, a bit older. These falling empires. That's interesting to me as a historian, I guess. But still, I would give it a 3 for substance. So, final scores: 4 for style, 3 for substance. Those are scores out of 5, which gives it a 7 out of 10 or a 3.5 out of 5. But I would stop to remind you once again that I use the full gamut of scores when I give things scores. At 3 out of 5 is average, 5 out of 10 is average. So we're talking a couple of points higher here. So it's a pretty good game. If you like your games more simulationist, and it's interesting to see that there's kind of a mini comeback of more simulationist games turning up, like Axe, Arcanis, I would say, and a few others. It's interesting to see that coming back, and it's nice to see games turning away a little from the vague sort of narrative form to something a bit crunchier. I don't particularly have a preference, but it's just interesting to see these kind of trends in game design come, go, shift, and certainly the people who like more crunchy games, they have been underserved for a very, very long time. So Arcanis might suit if you're looking for a fantasy game that still retains elements of fantasy but has enough crunch to be satisfying. There we go. That's my review. Definitely worth checking out. Maybe have a leaf through in the store if you see a copy there. Just don't start at the beginning, because front loading the lore, I think, really hurts the book. That would be my major criticism, and if I were to advise them at all on how to improve the game, I would say make the descriptions of the various empires and so on much shorter. Limit them to kind of the knowledge of people within those societies, what they think, and pass all the rest of the lore out to the DM book or something like that. That would be my recommendation. Zang.
Splatpunk is a retroclone RPG, so you can make your own Splatpunk games, whether that be cyberpunk, clockpunk, steampunk, biopunk, narcopunk, whatever it might be. You'll find this system adaptable to all your needs. Available at post-mort.com, lulu.com, and drive-through RPG.